Fernandez, and I'm here to introduce and converse with Vandana Shiva, one of the people. Vandana has been a huge inspiration in my life and in many others around the world. One of the best advocates for sustainable farming systems, connection to the land, and a big fight against agribusiness and the destructive global system. I thought I'd start with my story a little bit about how I started to learn about Vandana. In that, I work here in the UK with the Land Workers Alliance, trying to fight for better sustainable farming systems. But I started out in the US, in Louisiana, and I was in a little Louisiana school where I was one of the few small brown girls that I knew there. In fact, I knew hardly any small brown girls there. I spent a lot of time in nature. I had a tree house in my backyard. I'd go around on my bike trails, seeing all the trees and playing with the soil and playing in the creek and all those sorts of things. And all around where our house was, they started to build suburbia, and a lot of those trees got felled and lawns got planted, and it used to really affect me in a way I couldn't really understand, because I couldn't understand why are all these trees being cut down so that they can put in lawns with sprinklers, and they mow the grass and they rake up all the leaves and put them in bins and they get hauled away, when there was this amazing cycle of nature all around what's going on. And and it made me feel a little bit disconnected and a little bit lost with American society and American culture and what was going on there. And I went on to school, and I was in school, and I joined the debate team. And I was on my little high school debate team. And Louisiana schools, they teach you a lot about the American way, and there's a history that's taught in a certain way, and a science that's taught in a certain way. But on the debate team, one of the topics, and there's a national topic for the whole year, was development policy in Southeast Asia. And that's something I had absolutely no idea about, being in southern rural Louisiana. And I went to my debate camp, and I was going through all the books, and I started to read about the Green Revolution and how wonderful the Green Revolution was, because there was a lot of topics about that and how we had to convert all these systems over to an agriculture that could really feed the world, and And they all felt like, wow, what are they pushing on the world? It didn't quite feel right, even though it was all bigged up. And then I found Vandana Shiva's book, and I started to read it, and I thought, wow, there's somebody who's validating the knowledge systems of brown women, that is working with women who go out and they hug trees to stop them from being cut down. And I was like, I want to hug trees. and it made me think, there's something, a voice of truth here that's really right. And, and it talked all about what was wrong with the Green Revolution and this reductionist science that really took everything down to, you put this chemical on, you put this input on, and it actually does this, and it takes things apart. But what is it doing? Well, it's destroying the planet. To start to think about, how do we think about these things in the whole? And started to think about a world system that was really very, very different, was fundamentally so much different from the cosmology and the view that I was getting by being educated within the American system. And that was something that really built a fire in me. And I was able to go out there to these debate tournaments with, largely private educated white young men and beat the shit out of them and go, yes, I've got the evidence here. And it really felt good to, build that fire up in me. And so, later when I was 18 years old, I went to India with a scrap of paper in my pocket. This is pre-internet days, where somebody had given me Vandana Shiva's address. And I made myself way up to North India to her house. And I had a terrible stomach bug. And I kind of passed out on the doorstep and started vomiting loads. And Vandana wasn't even there. She was out doing her amazing work, and her family looked after me for a little while. And then she came back, and I was probably one of thousands of bright-eyed students that kind of rocked up to Vandana Shiva, thousands and thousands, and I'm sure you won't even remember the number of people you've spoken to and inspired. But, I had my little time for that little bit of advice. And I said, I want to come here to India to work with you and all the peasant farmers and the people that you're working with to save this planet. And she said to me, no, go to where you are. Go to where you are, because that is the belly of the beast. That is the heart of the beast, where you are. And put your energy in there and work there, because this is a global problem, and we've got to fix it. And it built the fire in me to go on and do the work that I'm doing now to try and uplift the voices of peasant farmers and indigenous people, the people whose knowledge systems are so invalidated that you know, though they have the tools to save the planet and are the ones that are feeding the planet, somehow they haven't got the narrative and they haven't got the power in the global system to actually be, you know, taken seriously. And Vandana has been working her whole life to uplift those voices. And so what I wanted to ask you, Vandana, is what has inspired you? Because the story of how you've inspired me and built the fire in me to go and spread it and build the fire elsewhere, I want to know where it came from for you. What were those earliest times when you started to feel that deep connection to spread the knowledge and the passion that you do now?
Well, I think the first time I felt something was wrong was when I saw a forest I was familiar with disappear. I'd gone to trek before leaving for Canada to do my PhD in quantum theory, hidden variables and non-locality in quantum theory. But, you know, I wanted to carry the mountains and the forest with me. And the forest wasn't there, and the stream, you know, streams come from forests. When the forest goes, streams disappear. And that's when I heard about the Chipko movement. I was so troubled. I'm waiting at the chai dhabas, for those of you who've been to India. We have these little tea shops along the road, and they're amazing knowledge centers. So I talked about how I had felt hurt. I felt like part of me had been chopped off, like you felt when the trees disappeared. And he said, but now there's hope. There's Chipko. And I asked him, what's Chipko? It wasn't in the newspapers. And he said, the women have started to act. Interestingly, Chipko started in a valley that's one of the tributaries of the Ganges. Now, our civilization, you know, realized that sources of rivers should be pilgrim centers. They're sacred spots. So the four most important pilgrim centers of India are the sources of the four tributaries of the Ganges. The Yamunotri, the Gangotri, the Badrinath, where the Alaknanda starts, and Mandakini, where Kedarnath temple is. So women in 72 in Alaknanda realized that there were more landslides, there were more floods as the logging was happening. And this woman called Gora Devi just, you know, stuck on the little path going up to the mountains and stopped the loggers. She said, you won't go and log. And then this idea spread and songs were created. A beautiful folk poet of our region, who was a dear friend of my mother's, started to write songs of Chipko. And he started to talk about Chipko in his music. And it said, we won't let our trees, our rhododendrons and oaks be cut. Nakatata, nakatata. We will rakha jagwali, we will keep them alive. And the action of keeping them alive was, we will hug the trees. Chipko means to hug. So I would love to tell Extinction Rebellion and everyone who's trying to stop the destruction, hug what you love, block what you resist. Because the hugging is a resistance and a creative act of protecting what you love. So every vacation I would come back to India and volunteer for Chipko. And I always say I went to the University of Western Ontario to learn foundations of quantum theory, but I went to the University of Chipko to learn from women who'd never been to school what biodiversity is, what ecology is, how livelihoods depend on nature. If I hadn't been involved in Chipko, I don't think I would have recognized that the issue of protecting the earth is protecting human livelihoods and human life. And in the West, we have not only the apartheid of separating the earth from ourselves. Nature is an object to be tortured, as Mr. Bacon said, you know, she must be tortured and enslaved to know her secrets. No, you don't know her secrets when you're trying to. You know nobody's secrets through torture. Torture is just a bad mechanism. And you know, before colonialism was the witch hunts. And the witch hunts wiped out the knowledge that we are part of nature. 9 million people killed in Europe, most of them women, for being healers, for knowing plants heal us. And this aggression is in a way got then embodied into the kind of science that's taught. And for me, it was an inadequate science. So I learned from Chipko that things are interconnected, that human lives are interconnected with the lives of nature. And more importantly, there's no separation between the rights of the earth and human rights. And Chipko was teaching us that. Yeah? For the women, the forests were not just the source of the water, not just the source of stable soils. We've just had a news yesterday that in this valley, Alaknanda, most important town just before Badrinath, the shrine, is sinking. And it's being evacuated because they're building so many roads and so many dams. And then you have climate change. 2021, we had a disaster. The glaciers are melting. The dam building is totally making the mountains fragile. And the first village of Gaura Devi, which Chipko started, is being evacuated. And that's the kind of grassroots knowledge that I didn't just, till that time, I too felt, got to go to university to know. Mm-hmm. And after Chipko, I realized you don't have to go to university to know, you just have to go to the earth. The earth has to be your teacher. And the women who work with the earth as part of the earth, for me, have been the longest teachers. The second thing that was so clear for me is you couldn't separate the water problem from the forest issue. You couldn't separate the forest issue from the agriculture issue. All the women of Chipko were peasant women. We should not just talk about it as a forest movement, we should talk about it as a farmers' movement. Mm. Because all the farming I learned, and because my own mother, I've written about it in Terra Viva, which is downstairs in the Chelsea Green bookstore. My own mother, highly educated, broke every glass ceiling, ended up being an inspectress of schools. When a line was drawn to divide India and Pakistan, I don't know how many of you know that when the British had been told quit India in 1942, and then they started to organize to make sure that they left a divided India. And the way India was divided was they just drew a line, which the man who was drawing the line didn't complete. He left an incomplete line. The Kashmir problem is an incomplete line that the British drew to divide India. So the Kashmir problem is there because the line of Kashmir never went through. So India claims it, Pakistan claims it. My mother became a refugee. And when she came back to India as a refugee, she said, well, I've done everything. I've done everything. Now I will be a farmer. Because farming, I realize, is the highest vocation. And as a refugee, she created, I was born while she was setting up a farm. My elder brother was born while, elephants, who used to come to her tent. She'd live in a tent. Mm-hmm. And for me, the farm was, in winter, peas, chickpeas, mustard, wheat, growing together. And your ability to go and collect your hara chana, your green peas and your green chickpea. It was swimming in the irrigation channels. It was, hanging on, we had a beautiful banyan tree with about 100 aerial roots. And that was our playhouse. I had no idea that that reality of the mountains and my mother's farm had changed till 1984. Mm-hmm. I'd done my MSc Honours in particle physics in the University of Punjab in Chandigarh. And Punjab in 1984 had erupted in violence. Now, in that period, I was working for the United Nations University on a major program on peace and global transformation, and I had been asked to look at conflicts over resources. Yeah? That what we call ecological issues are usually conflicts over resources. And Punjab happened in '84. And I told the UNU, something's wrong, and this is a conflict. People are dying, 50,000 people have died. But more importantly than that, I have files of river conflicts. I have files on land conflicts. But all this has disappeared. The newspapers only talk about a religious conflict. And I asked if I could do this study, and that's how The Violence of the Green Revolution that you read was written. It's published by Kentucky University Press in the States. I think it's published by Z Books, but Z Books has become someone else, BlackBerry.
I mean, it was pretty amazing at that time.
Yeah,
in the 1980s, because in the 1980s, you know, there really was no narrative against the Green Revolution.
And you know, because it was the first book that connected the ecological and social roots to the Green Revolution, of course I would start getting invited everywhere. And so often, after I'd got the invitation, I'd get a disinvitation.
Yeah.
Because the narrative was too troubling.
And so what did, what kind of reaction did you get from the scientists, from the people promoting the Green Revolution? Because this was a voice way ahead of its time to start to critique what's happening there. There's a lot of investment in that.
You know, I'm very fortunate that I've answered every puzzle I faced, whether it's disappearance of forests, why are they going? Why are eucalyptus coming all over Bangalore? Why is Punjab the most prosperous part of India, the land of violence? You know, I see violence and I ask the question, where does it come from? I had no idea that the whole world system had been invested in the so-called Green Revolution. First of all, those who think the word green, which is now a word for ecology, that it wasn't. You know, the Green Party hadn't been formed. In the 60s, there was no Green Party. The word green was just a word different from red. And red was what China was doing. So the narrative was, if you bring chemicals into agriculture, peasants will not go the China way. They will not seek justice through land rights, through just prices. They will become part of the market. And so the word green was merely, plants are green, yeah? And it's not red. And because I did the book at that time, I read everything. If I had to do the book today, I couldn't have written it. Because Mr. Google misused you hugely. Mr. Google would tell you people, you know, India was starving and people stopped starving after the Green Revolution. No, no one was starving. You know, 66 is when the Green Revolution was introduced. 67 is when I leave school. No one was starving around me. There'd been not a single famine death.
And did you spend time talking to the peasants and finding out?
Yes, of course I did. That's how I got involved with the peasant movement. But what had happened is, in 65, we'd had a drought. And the drought had led to an increase in prices. But more importantly than that, that was the time India was building these mega townships of industry, steel plants, and you know. And the workers were peasants. So when the food prices were rising, they said, why should we spend so much money on food? We go back to our village, where there's food. They wouldn't have gone back to their village if there was starvation. So they started to run away. They couldn't build the townships. So the challenge in India in 65 was reducing the prices. The Prime Minister of that time of India wanted to import a little more wheat to stabilize prices, not because of hunger. And Lal Bahadur Shastri was his name. And Lyndon Johnson was the president. He said, no, you cannot get more wheat till you change your agriculture. You must introduce chemicals in your farming. And Shastri said, no, I cannot do it on the oldest agrarian society and the largest group of farmers. Every fourth farmer of the world is an Indian farmer, even today. And he refused. Then he died mysteriously in Tashkent during peace talks. And the bullying carried on. The World Bank, USAID, Rockefeller, at that time there was no Gates Foundation, but Ford and Rockefeller, you know, they literally put conditionalities and imposed. The Green Revolution was just industrial farming. And because I did that book, I said, where do the chemicals come from? You know, I studied physics and chemistry. But I said, where do the chemicals for killing people come from? Because same year, Bhopal disaster had happened. Bhopal was a Union Carbide plant. Union Carbide had an ad that time. Carbide as a hand in India's future. And it's got a beaker pouring a red liquid. over a landscape of a farmer plowing the land. But when thousands died in Bhopal, it kind of became a negative prophecy. Union Carbide is now bought by Dow, which then merged with DuPont, which now comes as Corteva in BBC. And you won't realize it's a Corteva ad because they present it as news. All the work on digital agriculture and farming without farmers is that. So I did the research at that time. Where did the chemicals come from? And there were two other books that anyone interested in farming should read. Albert Howard, who was sent from Imperial England as the imperial botanist to change and improve Indian agriculture. He arrived, saw the farms were prosperous, soils were fertile, fields were full of insects, but no pest damage. And he said, I cannot teach the peasants. I will learn from the peasants, make them my professors. I will make the pest and the peasant my professors. And he wrote the book, The Agricultural Testament, which became the founding of the Soil Association. Eve Balfour was his friend. And in the United States, the Rodale Institute grew out of Harvard's work. And in there, he's got a para where he says, industry that had got used to selling chemicals and developed the NPK mentality didn't want to end its profits. So they actually changed agriculture to say without nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, you cannot grow food. And that is still carrying on. But the second is Rachel Carson, who wrote a book on pesticides. And again in the book she has said, companies that got used to selling chemicals to kill during the war continue to sell chemicals to kill. And I want to just share with you, yesterday on my traveling over, the digital version of the Financial Times looks like an article, but again, it's promoted. It's an ad. It's an ad from Crop Life. Now, when you think of Crop Life, like if you think green, you think it's about the earth. When you think Crop Life, you think it's about the life of the crops. But Crop Life is the name of what I call the poison cartel. 4 or 5 companies that control the chemicals and now control 60% of the seed. They control agriculture. They were the ones pushing GMOs. They have all the patents. And I happened to be at a meeting in 1987 because of the book I'd written on the Green Revolution, on the new biotechnologies and what they imply. This is 87. There was no GMO in the world at that time. 72, the scientists who had done the recombinant DNA research has said, we know how to do it. We don't know what it means. We don't know what it means ecologically, and we don't know what it means ethically. So we will put a moratorium. It's called the Asilomar Convention Moratorium on Recombinant DNA. Well, the companies found out that splicing genes can be a new way of owning life. And at this meeting of 87, they said it as much. We have to do genetic engineering in order to take patents, and to impose patents worldwide, we have to have an international treaty, which became the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Agreement of the GATT and WTO. That's what has led to 60% seeds in the hands of the corporations. And I know tomorrow there's a session on the GMO question. We can go deeper into this. But as they say, from the horse's mouth, I knew what they wanted to do. And so from that day onwards, I started to save seeds. And
did you ever feel scared about confronting the multinationals and these corporations that are pushing this agenda?
No, I was never scared, but I've experienced their shallow exercise of power, which they do. You know, they threaten me again. I sued Monsanto because they entered India illegally, and I know the laws because I've had a role in writing the Indian laws. And they've threatened me. And now recently, they literally, I think they are behind the eviction from a home of one of our colleagues in the GMO issue. You know, I fought the legal case 98 to 2002 when the regulatory structure was brought back, you know. Before that, it had been totally killed. And Aruna Rodriguez, a dear friend, who's been fighting the case since, say, 2005. So the issue is about fear. And, you know, I've done what I've done because of my 2 passions. my passion for truth and my passion for life. And every time I see a violation of truth, and every time I see a violation of life, I must first understand the roots of the violation and then act to stop it. But I was telling you about the Financial Times ad, literally, the letter. It's fascinating because it tells you about the doublespeak that surrounds the dominant discourse in farming. It's called Cultivating Crops in a Perma-Crisis. You know, we have permaculture. These guys are talking about a perma-crisis, that all crises will forever stay because we'll continue to create the problems that lead to the crisis. We will create climate change. We will create biodiversity extinction. So you'd better get used to a perma-crisis, and only we can rescue you. Small farmers won't survive this phase, is what? Now, James Hartman, who's Bayer's regional head of Europe, Middle East, Africa, he's quoted throughout. But the second subtitle of this paper, of this letter, is a love letter to the modern farmers. In effect, it's saying, you're finished. If you don't get enslaved to us, only we can save you. And Hartman says that our farmers share the best practices through forward farming. 60,000-year farming in Australia, 10,000-year farming in India. They aren't looking to see how did these systems last so long. What are the principles? Howard identified the two principles that have been my guide. The principle of diversity. Ecological systems are never monocultures. Not a forest, not a pasture, not an ocean, not a water body. All industrial systems are monocultures. And the second principle, which is vital, he called it the law of return. Liebig called it the law of recycling. But it's basically working with the cycles of life, the nutrition cycle, the hydrological cycle. And when I was working with Chipko and helping them with the forest question, this is what I was doing. The nutrient cycle, the hydrological cycle, those two cycles, if we get it right, we've got forestry right, we've got grazing right, we've got farming right, we've got our life right. So this love letter is basically, this is his last sentence. Digital farming enables traditional farmers to take part in an entirely new business model. So farming is not only a business model, but if you don't become part of the new business model of digital control, of ever larger farms, fake food from the labs. You know, Bob Ryder, another buyer person, says, in order for these new companies to produce plant-based products, they have to depend on us. Because the biodiverse systems cannot feed the huge appetite of trying to feed everyone with lab food. Farms will have to become raw material supplies of carbohydrates and protein. So first they made the biodiversity of plants disappear. Then they made and turned it into monocultures fed by chemicals. Now they want even the plant as an edible to disappear, to become raw material that unless it goes through the lab food route, and there's so many people promoting fake food as the only way to have a future, a farming without farmers, a food without farms. And all of you who gathered here, I think are the community that knows that farming with farmers who care is the only kind of farming that should be called farming. Everything else is war. Everything else is war against the planet, against the farmers, and against our health. Because as I've written in the chapter on food and the food movements, you know, what we've learned now is what everyone knew, that we are what we eat. The health of the soil makes for the health of the plants, and biodiversity and health of the plants makes for the health of our gut microbiome. And we are only 10% human. We are 90% the virome and biome. And we'd better learn a new humility, that we are not the top of the pyramid to exploit all other species and push them to extinction. We are part of a circle. And at the end of it, the microbes run us and eat us. So, the reason I got involved with the GM question is that meeting of 1987, where at that time they weren't the four. They were Ciba, Sandoz, Astra, Zeneca. Zeneca is just a new name of the old imperial chemical industry. And so in the process, through studies at that time, but continuing studies, I have to say, I've always said thank you to Monsanto, because if they hadn't been so illegal, I wouldn't have done the work I've done. If they hadn't wanted to prohibit farmers from saving seeds, I wouldn't be saving seeds, and I wouldn't be celebrating farmers' knowledge to save seeds, How much farmers know about seeds? When I started, the farmers had the seeds. These corporations didn't have the seed. Mm-hmm. I'm not finished yet, but at this point, they have 60% of the seed. It's all bad seed that doesn't renew, because seed bija, that which arises on its own forever and ever and ever, that's what a seed is. It holds life. Now they want, just like they want food to be raw material, they want seed to be, as they tried a European law, which we stopped, we defeated it, called the Plant Propagating Law. Mm-hmm. It was a seed law to make seed saving for your garden illegal. Mm-hmm. And we did a seed pilgrimage through Greece, Italy, France, and I worked with the parliamentarians at that time. And I watched how the beginnings of Brexit was the use by the biotech industry using England to escape regulation. Brexit's other name is escape regulation. Mm-hmm. So, I think what we need, and I'll work on it, I've just done a book called Greed to Care, but I'm going to do a dictionary on economic terms, and I think I'll do a dictionary on agriculture terms, because everything has been made to meet the opposite. Soil, the living soil, which is us. Empty container for pouring nitrogen, phosphorus into. Plant, a factory run by a fuel, synthetic fertilizers. I mean, we've taught ourselves such rubbish about how the world works. It's an exciting moment, when I went down to the Chelsea Green store, so many new publications coming out from the true science of interconnectedness, the true science of life. Mm-hmm. I wrote a book called, because this industry, the poison industry, which came from Hitler's lab, the IG Farben, Rockefeller, IG Farben and Standard Oil were one company. They worked together. Rockefeller and Standard Oil gave the money and the oil. The chemistry was done by IG Farben, the cartel in Hitler's Germany. They're together again. And just think all the time. So many people died in the World War II. Mm. But while people were giving their lives, the companies of the two sides were working together to make instruments to kill. Just think of it. Of why we always need to see how we are being used, manipulated, and sacrificed. Mm-hmm. 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 Right now, for the profits of a poison cartel of 4. They're 4, literally just 4. So, we can panic and be afraid of their power, or you can look at the shallowness of the foundations of that power. Mm-hmm. An edifice built on lies, on violence, on deregulation, on destroying democracy, mm-hmm. cannot stand. It needs a tiny bit of light. The darkness mm-hmm. can be made to disappear with one little candle. Mm-hmm. You just have to be the little candle.
I've noticed that you can really shine through the doublespeak in a way, in a way that illuminates that. And so from that illumination, how do we build the power to really fight that lie?
I think the first is, of course, knowing that we are not separate from nature. Because I think we've done too much harm from anthropocentrism. And we have crippled our possibilities through anthropocentrism. Because the human capacity is very little compared to the capacities of the web of life working together in harmony. And so we've got to realize we are part of the web of life. Do your tiny role right is a very powerful role. So we build the power by becoming smaller in arrogance and larger in relationship. The second is, the Baconian thinking was always about dividing, reductionism. I don't think we'll be able to change this well-orchestrated system, which has no place for nature, no place for people, even while it's stealing the language. This whole love letter to the modern farmer, is all about regeneration. You would think they created regenerative agriculture. But regenerative agriculture for them is regenerating their profits, for another quarter and another quarter. I think because food, and I've written it in Terra Viva, what I've learned after all these years, I started working on food and agriculture, in a deep way, from 1984. That's about 38 years. And a learning of 38 years is we've got to stop thinking of food as a commodity and start seeing food as a currency that flows. Because what is the nutrition cycle? The connection between the nutrients in the soil, the nutrients in the plant, the nutrients in our gut microbiome, that is food. And everything is food, as one of our Upanishads says. Everything is food, everything else, something else is food. So many of the philosophies that try and escape the food cycle get it wrong. That somehow you can have farming without animals. Very violent thinking that's being financed, I think. Because as long as there are animals on the farm, you are co-creators. You don't need the pesticides. You don't need the herbicides. You don't need the fertilizers. The animals, you, and the soil, you are the productive system in non-violent co-creation. So because food is a currency, I think we've got to start connecting those who are connected by food, which of course means those who are on the land, but I think it means all the beings of the earth. I don't think we'll get the food justice system right if we don't have justice for the earth or earth systems, for the soil organisms, for the pollinators. Everyone is just being, they're insect people, they're the mycorrhiza people, but everyone works on their little silos. If we connected and turn those silos into bridges, we are very powerful together. And of course, a farmer needs eaters. And so much, we know what ecological agriculture is. We know what regeneration is. We know what biodiversity is. What is new is how to connect the eaters with the growers of food, and how to innovate within a hugely unjust system that has decided most people don't need food. Most people can either starve, 1 billion people are starving, or the rest can get rubbish from food banks. Because actually, the system should take care of everyone's food rights. We have the largest feeding program in India, with a lot of struggle. The Food Security Act. But what we really need is not just more people included in the food system, but they keep talking about the cost of living crisis. That phrase gets to me. There's a denial of life crisis. The fact that we are at a place where we must buy our means to live is already a crisis. And therefore, regenerating livelihoods through the regeneration of the land has to be the revolution of our times. I know Satish will be somewhere at this conference, and he does meditation tomorrow. But Satish, as a Jain monk, and he must have told many of you the story, then left the monkhood and joined the Bhudan movement. Our movement of those who have land, giving the land to the landless. Started by Vinoba Bhave. And I think this occupy the land, take back the land back movements have to be a very important part, because this country started the enclosures. First in England, and then spread the enclosures all over the world. This is the time for reclaiming the commons, whether it's the commons of the seed, the commons of the water, the commons of the climate, the commons of our food, the commons of the land. So that's where our, the true creativity and imagination has to come in. And we'll need plural paths. We'll need, as I've said in my book, a biodiversity of movements. Just like biodiversity has to prosper on the land, biodiversity has to prosper in society. To make society politically powerful, it's the diversity that brings us power.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yes. So you've been doing this, you said really started pulling these pieces together of this puzzle that brings the social and the ecological and the science and the movements together in 1984 and really starting that fight. I think it would give us all hope as the movement of the people who are reclaiming the land, the people who are farming, the people who are building this narrative and really building on your wonderful broad shoulders here. What have you seen change since 1984? Some positive stories of things that have changed since then?
Huge, huge amounts. When we started, some of us who were troubled by the Green Revolution and the narrative created a group called Samuday and to basically explore parts of an ecological agriculture. Today, the organic movement is huge. And, part of what the poison cartel does to specialization is take whatever is strong and attack it. So if organic goes strong, they attack organic. For example, they attacked me for importing organic as an imperial concept. Mm-hmm. So I started the Harvard lectures. Where did Harvard get organic from? From India. Mm-hmm. It's just coming back to its roots. The seed saving, when I realized, I happened to be invited to this meeting where the poison cartel laid out, we'll own every seed. Every seed will be GMO, every seed will be owned by us, no seed that comes from the farmers will be allowed. And that's what the intellectual property rights laws are. When I started, no one was talking about saving seeds because seed was abundant. But I said, not from what's coming. Mm-hmm. Today we have 150 community seed banks in India, and the seed sovereignty movement is a global movement. Everywhere it is spreading, everywhere. And I talked about the European law, plant propagating law. We stopped it just by bringing together that remote Greek island, the seed savers of Italy and France. What else has happened is I think the science of living systems is exploding right now. We worked on organic farming and ecological agriculture, but now the science is reaffirming everything we've done, that the soil is living, that the connections with the plants and soil health makes the plant healthy, that the diversity of your diet and the health of your plants doesn't just feed you, it feeds your biome, And the complexities are just exploding right now. And to me, from the witch hunts to Hitler's Germany, to the attacks on Rachel Carson and the attacks on people today, they've been really an epistemic apartheid, an epistemicide, kill all knowledge that allows people to live. Let them feel they don't know, or make them feel. The new word for all this these days is conspiracy theorist. Yeah? If you see the connections, just like in the witch hunts, if you saw the connections, you're a witch. Today's name of the witch hunts is conspiracy theory. And I think the most important part of our movement is to live your truth, experience your truth, know your truth. Through your interconnections with the soil and the seeds and the plants, your food. Know your food. It's so radical, My father used to eat aloo matar ki sabji and see there's pesticides in the tomato today. That's the level of senses. His sensibility was so high. So those senses haven't gone away in spite of Descartes, who thought he's a thinking thing without a body. No, we are bodies with brains, and not just brains out here, the second brain in the gut microbiome. Every cell is alive. Nothing is dead. And that celebration of life in diversity, intelligence, creativity is, to me, the most hopeful thing that's happening. How many people can they shut down? How many farms can they shut down?
I'm looking out here and I see so many young people now that are putting those dots together in a way I never saw in my generation, and to me that's hope. Amazing, amazing. Wow. So we have a lot of questions here.
Sure.
I think.
You get them on your gadget?
I don't know. I have absolutely no idea how I find them. Look at this, I'm such a Luddite. So. Absolutely useless. Oh, first, okay, and then I'll do these little online ones. Oh, it's such a pleasure to have you here, honestly. It's wonderful, it's wonderful. Yeah, are there questions from here? Go on. Stand up, and there's a mic.
Thank you so much for that. I'm interested in, I don't want to talk about negative stuff, but with the Dasgupta review and the sort of commodification of nature, with the way that power is reacting to the obvious good sense of needing to go back to a greater interconnectedness with the land, is, you know, how do you see we work against that? Because even though we're very passionate, we're very few in the face of those that corporate capture of our governments and of our media.
Yeah. You know, I've felt very sad for England when your Prime Minister, one of the few that has fallen along the way, said, I have to liberate the GMO. Now, for someone who can reduce democracy and transform it from being accountable to people and listening to people and listening to nature to being liberate the GMO from ecological imperatives, from regulations, from health and safety. It basically is not just an issue of capture, because the capture is at the policy level. I think the thing we have to be very awake to is the capture of our minds. And I know when the climate discussion was happening, I made one of my trips, I think I was coming from Schumacher College back to London, and somewhere along the way there was a meeting, and many of the environmentalists were saying, oh, we won't be able to deal with climate change without genetic engineering. And I had to tell them, no, farmers have bred seeds that are resilient to salt. We save those seeds, resilient to floods. The millets, resilient to drought. And in any case, genetic engineering is a crude technology that can only move single genes across species and make a multiple set of traits. But it cannot create multi-genetic traits. Only living systems do that. Engineering cannot. But we lost a decade where some of the climate, people who think you can separate the biodiversity question from the climate question, they thought it's all right. And many people are accepting gene editing, again with a similar kind of panic. I think the most important thing we have to do is not look at how small we are, how few we are, but how large we are. Minute you think not in anthropocentric ways of humans, but in ecocentric ways as part of the web of life, 7 billion people embedded in trillions of other species, just put the microbes and the microbes together, how rich we are. And those guys are powerful. We got to join them, learn from them, and say, you lead the way to show how the small can defeat the super large.
Woo!
The distorted large, which doesn't know when to stop growing. Only one entity in the biological world doesn't know when to stop growing. All living systems grow and die, grow and die, grow and die. The cancer cell has to destroy the body on which it feeds itself. It doesn't know when to stop growing. This deregulation is a cancer of limitless corporate growth. It's ecologically wrong because we are on a planet with limits. But it's wrong politically and democratically. Because to allow the growth of the crop lives and they're writing love letters to the farmers they're pushing to extinction means being, living in an ocean of lies. When lies guide policy, you don't have policy. You have genocide, you have ecocide.
Mm-hmm. I like to think about the fact that it's growing so large that it'll come to its natural end, and all of these are the roots and the knowledge and the things that will really grow and survive for all of you. Another question?
Thank you so much. That was absolutely profound.
A bit closer?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So a question on the Rockefeller Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
They've recently just invested hundreds of millions into Dan Barber's Blue Hill Farm as... sorry.
Yeah.
So they've recently invested millions, hundreds of millions of dollars into Dan Barber's Blue Hill Farm in the US, as well as Paul Stamets, who, we perceive as the good guys. How do we differentiate people like the Rockefeller Foundation and the Gates Foundation when they are under the guise of the good guys? Could you explain a bit more about that?
Well, as my own personal guide, I've never made decisions on the basis of exceptionalism, but on the basis of the patterns. Not the exception to the pattern, which is extremely good for PR. But what's the regular pattern? I think people need to see that Rockefeller was the leading robber baron, that Standard Oil had to be broken down in the familiar names we have now, the Exxons and the rest of them, because it was one Standard Oil. It was the antitrust law at that time. But the Great Depression, the two parts of the American crisis that was created really by the Rockefeller model was one, destroying the soil, the Dust Bowl, and the Great Depression. And in a way, we're in that same situation. We're having Dust Bowls everywhere and Great Depressions everywhere. Except that the strength of national systems was dismembered through a global system, which is now driving deregulation. So, I think those of you who want to see where the Rockefellers and the Gates are taking the world, look at what they're doing to the climate treaties. I was part of the drafting of these treaties at the Earth Summit in 1992, or in the pre-summit negotiations. And then the climate treaty had a very clear thing that there have been polluters, which were the industrialized countries, and the polluters must pay. Today, everyone is celebrating that in Egypt, which is sponsored by Coca-Cola, they got a loss and damage clause. 92 to 2022, they haven't implemented polluter pays. They're making it look like they're being sweet to the Pakistanis who are drowning in the floods. The second is the Biodiversity Treaty, in which I had a very big role. Article 19.3 on GMOs. I worked very hard to talk to governments to make them realize how biodiversity would be destroyed by biotechnology. So the Article 19.3 says government must regulate GMOs and look at the impact on biodiversity. This Montreal, the summit which should have been in China but now was taken to Montreal, most of it was financializing biodiversity. In your country, they're rushing ahead with something called biodiversity offsets. Mm-hmm. You can take an ecologically rich, biodiversity-rich area, be destroyed by a developer who will plant some eucalyptus trees somewhere else. And that's the kind of offsetting which is not ecologically equivalent, but is an escape valve from responsibility. Mm-hmm. Carbon offsets is a new way of land grab. If you read, the net zero language is, we'll keep polluting, but we'll get someone else's land to be a carbon sink. And I've debated all these big guys. I said, we are not your carbon sink. Mm-hmm.
And it's often the peasants protecting the biodiversity whose land.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think our first priority has to be see what's the right action for us and spread that like the seed spreads. And understand the limitless greed, the cancerous greed of the big guys. And both, of course, share more information. Rockefeller is thinking of making 4,000 trillion financially out of a collapsing planet. Mm-hmm. They call them natural asset companies.
What?
4,000 trillion. So I think definitely be awake to them. Don't be obsessed by them. Don't let them guide you into fear. Let them guide you into a new awakening.
Nina?
Thank you especially for what you said about caring, that caring was everything else is war. And I couldn't find a better formulation. I think that's really fantastic. I am part of the Global Women's Strike, and we are having an international campaign for a care income for people and planet as one thing, just really like you described. We had a great workshop yesterday where women from Thailand and from Andhra Pradesh in India spoke about the work that they're doing, and I wanted to ask you specifically about Andhra Pradesh and the women's self-help groups there, which are regenerating the soil and have really spearheaded that movement. And they assume that within the next few years, the whole state will be doing natural farming without chemicals. And we are really spreading the word, as you said, find what needs to be spread and spread that. And I wondered what you knew about that and whether you know of anything else going on like that in India as well. Thank you. Regenerating the soil. Yes, they're regenerating the soil in order to stop climate change. That's part of the whole thing. Thank you.
Yay! Yay for the soil. We've got a question here from somebody online that says, what role can faith play in, except it's disappeared, faiths play in respecting creation and nurturing sustainability? You know, the diverse faiths that people follow, but how can they play a role?
Yeah. Well, you know, just like seeds are being commodified and food are being commodified, faith is being commodified at that high institutional level. But faith is also your guiding force, you know? There's an institutional system, but there's the system you live by your values. And, you know, my book, Oneness versus 1%, written how divide and rule is, you know, just like the partition of India. The divide and rule now is always take anything, put a focus on religion, make people fight. Yeah? Very standard response. The algorithms have got it perfect. People want their land, turn it into a religious conflict. People want food, turn it into a religious conflict. And what we need to do, of course, is stick to our real problems and for the faith communities to work in their pluralism for the deeper values that you share. So I remember when the food crisis was starting, I brought all the faiths together, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, the indigenous cultures of the tribals, the dominant narratives of the Hindus. And I said, okay, everyone's fighting on religion. You tell us what your faith tells us about food. Everyone, whether the Bible or the Quran, everyone says this. No one says starve your neighbor. Everyone says take care of your neighbor, feed your neighbor. Every faith says grow food in abundance. It's your ethical duty. Every faith says distribute it in abundance. Don't ever deny someone food. Don't ever deny someone seed. So I think faiths have a big role, and you know, I've defined GMO very often as God move over. That faiths have a big role in saying creation is not what Monsanto does. Mm-hmm. Creation has a deeper cosmological meaning.
Mm-hmm. And that faith holds across all religions, yes. We have another question about how does hydroponics fit into this picture, and it's a woman from the Netherlands asking that, where there's a lot of hydroponic systems.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know, as a scientist, I don't reject things just because I don't like it. When something is proposed, the first question I ask, if it's proposed as organic, how equal is it to organic ecologically? And since my lifetime of work on food and farming has taught me, the two criteria in an ecological system are, is it based on a negative entropy? Yeah? Does it use external inputs or does it generate its own energy? And the second is that what's the quality? What's the quality of the food? Now we have new systems. I mean, Alice is sitting here from Shumei, and they do amazing work with the Swiss scientists, how organically grown grapes produce a wine that has total crystalline form, and the chemically grown wine is totally smudged, you know, because there's a deep structural pattern in organized living systems. And in polluted systems, whether it's water or food, it shows up. I have asked many people in the hydroponic system. I've asked them about the energy equation. We know industrial agriculture uses 10 units of energy to produce 1 unit of food, bad food. Ecological agriculture uses 1 unit of energy to produce 10 units of good food. I think hydroponics uses more than the 10 units of energy because it's very energy intensive. They don't tell you that because instead of having the beautiful energy of the sun given for free, they're trying to substitute it with all kinds of artificial light. And I don't think that energy equation has actually been assessed in an honest way. Second, the nutritional, we know industrial farming created nutritionally empty commodities. Food has lost 70 to 80% of its nutrition. It's tough. You just weigh it and put it in a container. But it is not edible anymore in terms of nourishing all the diversity in your gut. It's missing in ingredients. No one has shown me a study of hydroponics where all the plant gets is the external inputs, like in industrial agriculture you put nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, but all kinds of trace element deficiencies are coming up. I'll give you a simple example. So, you know, we measure our soils every 10 years. And the zinc on our organic soils have gone up 44%. In the chemically farmed soils in our valley, they've gone down 22%. And this amazing public health doctor in Australia was visiting, and she saw this data, and she said, now I understand why our teenagers are depressed. Because she works on the links between public health and the brain chemistry. And the brain chemistry was showing her there's a zinc deficiency. So the zinc deficiency in our food is having huge impacts, not just on our body status, but even on the mental health status, or whether we are happy about the world or we are depressed about the world. So none of that work has been done. I mean, when the world will be eating lab food, eating hydroponic food for over 1 or 2 decades, then maybe one scientist will do this study. But so far, the two key indicators of what the nutritional flows are and the energy flows are have not been done.
Yeah. It's shining the light, isn't it? We have another question about, could you comment on the situation in Sri Lanka and what happened there with the transition to organics?
Yeah, I think it's a wrong framing of the question, because the Sri Lankan crisis was a crisis of debt. It was a crisis of debt because the then president just loved big things, as so many rulers of the world do, big infrastructure, for which they had to borrow heavily. And all this borrowing and external debt, whether it was to IMF, World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, or BlackRock, as the new private investors, they were extracting money. Then came COVID and the lockdown. What are Sri Lanka's prime economies? Tourism collapsed. And through the foreign exchange they earned, they used to be able to pay back the debt. Now the debt was there, but the paying back wasn't happening. Expatriate earnings, foreign exchange returns. That wasn't coming. And their exports of teas and spices, that too collapsed during that time. So the debt kept piling and the earnings had collapsed. That's when the president said we must not spend more money on importing fertilizers. 300 million is what they were spending, I think. And he overnight said we won't import. Now, the agricultural community contacted me and said, will you train our scientists? Because our agriculture system is designed for chemicals. So I did a few trainings, but of course the poison cartel was waiting. They've erased the debt crisis. They've erased the fact that there's a strong organic movement in Sri Lanka before this, and that movement continues, and it's only those farms that have survived the doubling of fertilizer rates, the doubling of energy rates as a result of all the speculation going on. And most importantly, they don't allow people to look at Cuba, which when the sanctions, US sanctions, blocked the flow of oil and fertilizer, they changed to organic. I have been there for their organic programs. The horses on the field because the tractors couldn't run. The urban gardens just put the food on the gates of the garden for anyone to take any time. And, you know, we are all working on systems which don't need fertilizer. So this narrative of the poison cartel that and he only allowed, I think 6 months later he withdrew the ban. 6 months of a ban on fertilizer does not make economies collapse. When done right, it can actually lead to huge regeneration of economies. When done wrong, it feeds into the debt crisis.
I think it really shows the importance of building those strong roots so that when a crisis hits, you've actually got something that can grow and develop into something super strong. And we've got one last question related to that, which is, so much of Western academia teaches the lies of the industrial system are the truth, yet many researchers' work proves these lies are untrue. How can we change the education system to break this destructive pattern? And I think to build those really strong roots so that when things do break down, when this ever-growing capitalist system that can't keep continuing growing breaks down, that we've got those strong roots in place and that knowledge in place?
Well, I think the first is we all have to become farmers. And that doesn't mean, you know, begin with saying, oh, the land is too expensive, can't get access to farm. Well, you can have access to one pot, right? You take care of one plant, you're a farmer. You take care of a garden, you're a farmer. The word farming, the Anglo-Saxon roots are so rotten because it's based on enclosures of the commons. You know, farming is where you pay rents because someone else owns it. The British announced in 1783 that all the land of India belonged to England. And the peasants of India had to pay the rent. $45 trillion moved here. Our peasants died of hunger.
45 trillion.
45
trillion came to England.
And 40 to 60 million of the peasants who were producing the food died of famine because they couldn't access their own food because it was going as rents. Farming is not paying rents. Seed is not paying intellectual property rents to Monsanto. It has a life of its own. Farming is care for the land, care for the earth, regeneration. And that, no matter how small the scale, we have to begin with where we are, as I said years ago to you, and on the scale where we can work, while knowing that if we work together, we can increase the scale. Second, that the very act of taking care of the soil and the seed and the plant and the food is education. The soil teaches you. The seed teaches you. The seed teaches you 3 simple lessons that have been wiped out in Western education. That life is living, that living life organizes itself, and living life creates abundance. So we are made to think of scarcity. We are made to think of the destructive power being the creative power, and that's where the confusions are. And then, of course, we need all kinds of learning centers, you know, like the Schumacher College here. And Satish Kumar, you know, came to Navdanya and nudged me, and I started the Earth University with him, the Beach Vidyapeeth, the Seed University, the Earth University. We need to basically create catalysts to both spread the knowledge, not from human to human, but a living earth to humans, to other beings. And that is the creative process of education and learning that we have to shift. Learning is not read, write, what is it? Triple R's, what? Reading, writing, arithmetic.
Yeah.
No, education is learning how to live with Mother Earth as a children. Is it time?
We actually have one more. Here we go. Do you like to do?
I need to ask Vandana a question of what she's just said.
Just a minute. We'll listen to this gentleman first.
I'm so afraid that you won't let me in. This is so passionate.
Just a minute, in a minute.
Hi, this is actually quite relevant, hopefully. So everyone's probably seen the headline of Rishi Sunak wanting to make mass compulsory to every kid up to 18, which I think is madness. And I think, leading on for your education thing, is that a lot of kids in inner city don't know where milk comes from. They know they're sort of farming, ecology illiterate. And how do we get into the syllabus or into teaching in inner cities and everywhere, the education of connecting with your food and the land? Because I grew up in a farming community in Devon, and I maybe had one lesson in biology about growing stuff. I mean, I learnt, my limited amount on the farm. My parents weren't particularly good teachers. So how do we get the kids, to learn this stuff?
Yeah. I think, what we've started in India, I started with the widows in the GMO cotton area. But then I saw children were getting overwhelmed, young children were committing suicide, because that education merely creates pressures. And with the lockdown, it was even worse. So we've created gardens of hope everywhere. And how the garden can teach you biology, it can teach you geology, it can teach you geopolitics, it can teach you everything. So I think every school should have a garden, but I think every community should have a garden. Every child, no matter how deprived they are, should have the possibility to have the ultimate teacher, which is nature. There's research in Japan that shows just one walk in the forest once a week for those who are depressed allows them to come out of depression. Because it's our relationships, these invisible relationships that the Cartesian world cannot measure. Mr. Gates said there's only res extensa. What I can be a measuring rod and then measure, and what I can measure is real. No, it's what you can't measure that's real. It's the relationships that are real, that create the objects that we see and can measure.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think it's time now, right? Okay.
There's one down there.
Okay. Yeah. And you also? Yep.
We are hearing such wisdom. Oh, thank you. We're hearing such wisdom, it's obvious. Here we are in Oxford, and how does Oxford awaken itself to what you're saying? It's so powerful. Thank you.
Are you from Oxford?
I live here, but I'm not part of the academic, except I know lots of wonderful people.
I'm not. I left academics in '82. I found academics interfering in my intellectual search, And I wanted to live a bigger life and see bigger things. One area. So I work with the mayor of Paris and the C40 mayors. And I've worked and met the wonderful architect and urban designer who's created the 15 minutes idea of a city. Like the Indian bazaars, You step out of your house and you go get your neighborhood store. The idea of the neighborhood store, there was Jane Jacobs who realized that the neighborhoods which were mixed use, where living and working were in the same place, were the safest, healthiest, happiest neighborhoods. So he, learning from Jane Jacobs, tried to do this. Now, Oxford or Oxfordshire, whatever it's called, has just tried to pass a new law.
A very small city.
Or a new law of the 15-minute city, which does not make facilities available in every neighborhood, have farmers' markets everywhere, so you don't have to go to a supermarket. They've created a new policing system where cars will be monitored. They'll be given a quota, how often can you leave the 15-minute zone, and how much you'll be fined. No, 15-minute is the infrastructure of life being created around 15 minutes, not the infrastructure of a surveillance system being created. Because as a brilliant Harvard professor, Susanna Zuboff, has written, the age we are living in is the age of surveillance capitalism.
Wow.
The extraction of our data is the highest mining. The modification of the data through algorithms to manipulate our behavior is the biggest market. That's where the growth is taking place. We've got to decide where our freedom comes from and live that freedom. Yeah? So you can do it with a 15-minute city.
Vandana, just, I'd like to just take it a little bit further, this deep wisdom that you're constantly insinuating. We don't know how to use it. Do you think that our brains need some kind of new input and something more intuitive, more mystical, more beyond brain, as we call it?
No, your brain doesn't need an input. Your brain does that anyway. You have to stop the silencing of that part of your brain.
Yeah. One more? Okay. There was a question back here. The last question.
Down there.
In the yellow.
Down there.
Down. Oh, maybe not anymore.
Maybe not.
Got busy.
I would like to just, you said that the seed teaches three things. Could you just repeat them again? You said that a seed teaches three things, and one of them was...
The first is that it's alive. Second is that it organizes its life. You know, you put a little seed into a pot. The tomato seed will grow to be a tomato seed. It won't get confused and become a rice plant. And the third is seed multiplies and creates more of itself. Therefore, the notion of scarcity is a construct from Mr. Adam Smith. Abundance is the reality of nature which the seed teaches us.
And on that note, there was a sign I saw the Indian farmers holding during the Indian farmer protests that said they thought they could bury us, but they didn't know we were all seeds. And thank you for being the catalyst, the planter, the nurturer that's really planted so many seeds in all of us to carry on and build this new world that we all know is possible. Thank you. Thank you.